So let's take a look at points on unit power for the Genestealer Cults. Which units are looking strong or weak now the Codex is out and the points costs are revealed. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Genestealer Cult, and now the Codex and the points costs are revealed, I thought we'd take a look through the units and a rough impression of how powerful things are. At time of recording, it is kind of early days for Codex Genestealer Cults. The Codex came out, and then they've been waiting for their points cost for a little while until they launched alongside the balanced data slate. They haven't been out for too long, and the Codex has been kind of turned on its head a little bit. Lots of new attachments, lots of unit nerfs, the points costs have decreased to try and make up for that power loss. And likely for the next few weeks or so, the army is going to be in a bit of a period of experimentation with people trying to work out what's best for them. At the moment, it means this tier list is going to be a bit on the predictive side, based on stat lines, points costs, and all the online discourse around how the army is looking like it's functioning from now. I take this one as a first take. Hopefully I'll try and follow up with some tournament army lists to see what works in the wild when people start to actually hit the competitive scene with it. My first guess is that a few of the units in the Codex do seem like they are a bit overcosted, and I wouldn't be too surprised if next update a few things don't go down in cost, though I guess we'll wait and see on that front. As per normal, tier lists in 40k do tend to be a bit arbitrary. Depending on your exact army and playstyle, certain things could be ranked a little bit higher or lower, and particularly in 10th edition, detachments make things vary really quite a lot. Particularly for the Genestealer Cult, it feels like a lot of their detachments are really quite unit focused, so there's a lot of stuff that's far better in its own themed detachment, and then not quite as exciting elsewhere. It means that realistically, you'd have different tier lists based on the detachments, though for this one I'm mainly going to try and go off core datasheet strength, and try and mention the relevant detachments on each unit's entry as to what things that might make that unit a bit more stand out in certain armies. With all that said though, let's jump into it. Genestealer Cult units ranked into 5 rough tiers of power, and certainly feel free to let me know if you think anything else should have been ranked a bit higher or a bit lower. Finally, just a quick aside before we get into the tier list proper, I would just like to quickly mention the channel giveaway, which for the July one will be 6 copies of either the Genestealer Cult Biosanctic Brood Surge Battle Force or the Sisters of Battle Army of Faith. I'll talk about that a bit more at the end of the video if any of you guys are interested in entering for that. First up, in Tier 5, unfortunately this one hasn't really changed since last time I made the tier list. I really don't think that the Magus was helped out enough by the Codex. It got a bit of shifting around with their rules. The debuff ability for shooting now worked out to 18 inches, so it means that the opponent isn't as easy just to backpedal and avoid it, though the big penalty of rolling that 6 no longer turns off shooting, it just gives you -1 to hit and wound. Otherwise the cancel battle shock is okay, but not crazy, and she's got some okay damage output in close combat, though not excessive amounts. I just feel like the buff is a bit too reactive rather than active. I guess you could have her as a cheap character for Xenocrease, but realistically I think that you'd get more value from Acolyte Icon wards. Moving on to Tier 4, and here are some of the datasheets I consider perhaps the most overshadowed. Aberrants, unfortunately, I don't think got the points cost that they needed. There are 150 points per 5 of them, or 300 per 10. They definitely needed to go down quite a bit from the 180 that they were before, given that their defense got worse on the Feel No Pain, and their damage is much less threatening at Strength 7 damage 2. But I feel like dropping from 36 points to 30 points per model really wasn't enough. For their base stats, I feel like you can just get better value elsewhere now. Still maybe not unusable with certain combos like the +2 to charge one from Host of Ascension where you get the sustained hits, though I feel like the only place that they're going to be really tempting might be Biosanctic Brood Surge. They've got good value from the extra attack and the charge buff, and a fair few of the other stratagems and the infiltrate enhancement. The Biophagus looks like probably the way to go for them now, I think. Lethal hits does help round them out a bit against the toughest stuff in the game, but I feel like they still need to cost less overall. In a similar vein, I've also chosen to rank the Abominant down here, unfortunately. His stat line got a little bit beefier, getting an extra attack, but in reality is still not particularly more threatening than before, as he lost sustained hits on his own attacks, so the boost is only very small. As well as that, his durability was nerfed, and he swapped the sustained hits damage boost for the fights on death on a 4+, which I think is okay. Though it is a bit dependent on the army that you're fighting, will be great against melee, but pretty bad against primarily ranged armies. Overall, I just think that you're more likely to get reliable value out of the Biophagus, particularly as he went down in cost as well. He could be fun in the Biosantic Brood Surge though, and is one way to get some extra enhancements on Aberrants. The other unit that maybe feels like it's just standout overcosted are the Aslan Jackals. They're 90 points per 5 or 180 per 10. That points cost is unchanged since pre-Codex, and since then, they had a small nerf to the demo charge rule, meaning that you don't get quite as many hits with that. They've lost some power weapons, but they did gain the stealth keyword, so they are a little bit tankier against range damage. Overall, though, I feel like being 90 points just isn't great for their sort of outrider screening type role. Ideally, those sort of units tend to do well if they're a cheap sacrificial unit that you don't care about losing too much, and 90 points just feels a bit too much for that, and even with stealth, they're not standout durable in any way. I feel like they're not totally unusable, and like the Aberrants, they're better in their unique detachment. They've got a fair bit of support from Outlander, with better objective control, stratagem support, and a return to reserves option. But again, I feel like they're a unit that could do with going down in cost. Otherwise, there's the Jackal Alphas at 60 points, who are given a rate the Jackals as not particularly strong. I feel like a maybe support character for them isn't really going to do any better. For their role that they normally have of sort of cheap skirmish style units, you generally don't want to be over investing in characters as well. She gets a sniper rifle that could potentially be a threat to sort of medium support characters. He gets to mark the target for reroll ones to hit if she hits it. I guess that could be alright if you had some scary firepower, like say marking a target for a bunch of mining laser shots from Ridge Runners. And then she gives move, shoot, move for Jackals, which is a fairly nice boost. That does mean that they can get about the board even faster and maybe do a bit of attacking an enemy and then staying safe. Still seems a bit on the weak or underwhelming sort of side. I'd say she's probably going to be best in Outlander Claw, where you can get a -1 to hit with a relic sniper rifle as well, and it just makes more sense to build around Jackals in the first place, given that they get way more support. Moving onwards and upwards to Tier 3, these are the datasheets I consider a bit more usable. Perhaps one that I was debating putting either here or up in Tier 2 were the Handflamer Acolytes. They're now the ranged version of the Acolyte Hybrid Squad, 75 points per 5, so 10 less than they were previously, getting 2 demo charges per 5 and 3 Handflamers. And their core rule is the one that gives you reroll wound rolls with 4 rerolls when you're targeting things on objectives. These guys really are kind of substantially reduced. Since the pre-Codex version though, the demo charges are strength 9 and only get d6 shots, and even with the full wound rerolls going on, that means that they're going to be far weaker against the vast majority of targets, and battle line things don't respawn super easily anymore, and these guys are just crazily fragile for 75 points. They are still one of the units that can use a whole bunch of interesting synergies though. They can be buffed by all sorts of characters, use transports effectively, and use the Ridge Runner AP buffs or the Primus reroll hit buffs. They've got some nice advantages in Xenocrete, though I feel like they're still probably going to be most relevant in Ascension Day, given that you can just drop just outside of 3 inches and throw demo charges about. Overall though, I do feel like they needed to drop further in cost if the demo charges were going to get dropped in damage quite this much, and their low durability is harder to bear if there's less chance of them respawning. Moving on, the Goliath Rock Grinder dropped down to 120 points, so -10 from the 130 it was before. It's an interesting kind of unit where it's got an okay melee threat, with 8 attacks at strength 10, damage 2, plus likely a big anti-tank mining laser with shooting, and then some demo charges and a transport capacity. If you can get some good use out of both the range and the melee damage, it seems alright in terms of its damage output. I just wouldn't say it's particularly tough for the cost at just 10 wounds at toughness 10 for 120 points. And it does need to be on the front line if it wants to have a chance of that drill dozer blade getting to bear. Otherwise, it lost its mortal wound rule on charging, its tank shock isn't as good as it could be before, and it swapped the mortal wound rule for a desperate escape type rule. Sometimes that could be annoying for the opponent, a lot of the time it just might not get close enough to make it happen or just kill the thing that it charged. And it still could be kind of irrelevant if the opponent could just countercharge and kill it with something. Overall still feels a bit pricey for what it is, particularly given the rules changes without the big mortal wound damage. I guess probably something that should be most useful in Outlander, I suppose, though even then the stratagems that you can use on it don't feel enormously efficient on an 120 point vehicle. Next up, I feel like the Locus is more relevant in the Codex compared with the Index, 45 points for fights first in an Acolyte or a Metamorph style unit. I think for 45 points his own melee stats are okay, a bunch of strength 5 AP2 damage 2 hits. I think he's really profited from Acolytes actually having a melee datasheet that you might actually want to use as opposed to just take demo charges every time. And Metamorphs got significantly improved, and just melee buffs and advantages got a lot better in the Codex versus the Index. Fights first is quite a nice rule, and I think it's got enough damage otherwise. For 45 points he maybe doesn't feel super essential, though he is quite fun. Could be kind of nice to surge move into the enemy with Metamorphs, and then you still be able to fight first, even if the enemy countercharged you. Next up, we've got the Patriarch in the Big Bog itself, 85 points, and this adds a bit of fairly general purpose melee with Strength 6, AP 2 and Damage 2 and Twin linked, and also devastating wounds to his unit, helping the Pure Strains punch up a bit. The biggest change in the Codex is that he can take enhancements now, though you can still only have one Patriarch max, and the best enhancement he can take is in the Biosanctic Brood Surge, getting a very nice 3 damage there, and I feel like that's the difference between him being a sort of medium threat character and being genuinely very good for the cost. It does mean that you need to build quite a pricey infiltrator unit if you want to use him, and I feel like it's a unit that there is a danger that you might not get the points back on. You might just charge into something, kill something that's just a bit less than their points cost, and then get wiped out with relative ease when you're exposed to the enemy. So I guess something that you do need to play with kind of intelligently. Next up, the Acolyte Icon Ward still seems alright. He got a points bump from 50 points up to 60 in the Codex, which is a shame. He still gives his 5+ Feel No Pain, which is quite nice for big neophyte blocks, where that does make them significantly harder to kill. And otherwise he has that rule to rescue a blip token. If the enemy moves forward and takes one out, then he can put it back on the battlefield next to him, so the unit doesn't get wiped out. He also has Scout keyword and has a better Feel No Pain with Metamorphs, and he's a central unit for the Xenocreed detachment. I guess maybe even the melee acolytes could be an interesting one with him. For 130 points you could have them sat on the home field objective farming command points and rescuing blip tokens, though maybe that's a bit of overinvestment in the home field perhaps. Overall he feels alright but still not enormously standout. Next up we have the Nexos. He went up to 60 points from 50. His wording was slightly changed in the Genestealer Cult errata. One model in your army gets to reduce the cost of a stratagem by 1 command point for their own unit once per battle round, a slightly different rule compared with the Index. As per printed in the Codex it would have worked with battle tactics, but now it can be used on other things as well, which is fairly nice. It at least makes him a bit more relevant in most of the detachments. Besides that, he also has the ability to reposition a cold ambush marker. You get to move it 6 inches in both players' command phases, so it could mean that you can keep one safe from the enemy trying to wipe it out, or maybe move it up close if it is going to be safe, so the unit gets back into the fight a bit easier. I guess arguably that could be a bit more important now that you can't just immediately return that ambushing unit straight back into reserves. I feel like for 60 points though, he needs to be part of some sort of big central damage combo where you're probably going to be spending command points on multiple turns, maybe Primuses with the lethal hits in Ascension Day, and use the critical hit stratagem with the Nexos maybe. I feel at 60 points he does feel like a bit of a luxury, particularly as you can't be using him to double up on stratagems anymore now. At 80 points we have the new Benefactors, the big brain psycho with the anti-tank shooting, giving you 2 lethal hit last cannon shots hidden within a unit, and he gives himself plus the rest of his unit lethal hits as well, which is kind of big for Genestealer Cults at the moment since they've had a bunch of their anti-tank damage toned down in different ways. That is one way to make things threaten tanks a bit more than they would otherwise. That lethal hits one could be quite nice in Outlander with the reroll hits enhancement that you can get when you jump out of a transport, or any other ways that you can reroll hits elsewhere in the Codex. I feel like at 80 points you are paying a bit of a steep premium for that good anti-tank damage. 80 points does just seem a bit more than it's worth. He does have enough damage for that points I think, but given that he's adding absolutely no defense to your army pretty much, the price tag for him did need to be a little bit lower I suspect. Next up, we've got the man with the radio waves in the Clamorous. He remains 50 points and is unchanged. He now has 2 quite useful objective support rules to add to the army. He still has his Deny Deep Strike at 12 inches. It doesn't confer to the whole squad, but they can still zone out some areas of the board, and potentially you could even think about running him solo if the enemy doesn't have any indirect fire. That way you could basically guarantee that he was unchargeable from reserve, and you deny that section of the table to enemies trying to drop stuff on it. His other debuff is the Battle Shock one, where you get to nominate a unit within 18 inches to take a Battle Shock test in your own command phase. That can be quite a big deal if it means that you flip an objective from the opponent's control to yours. Overall, I feel like he's the type of model that will genuinely get played in some competitive tournament lists, though I feel like he's one that tends to do better at sort of top-level big-brain shenanigans gameplay, trying to win grand tournaments and things, and probably genuinely isn't as much use for players playing more casually, where it might be a bit more about damage and defense that are important to them. Still seems like he's a usable enough objective support for the cost, though. Finally for this tier, I've chosen to rank the Sanctus here. I was a bit borderline between putting him tier 2 versus tier 3. I could have fairly happily ranked him 1 tier upwards. 50 points for a lone operative is just generally good news in itself. and then he comes with a fair bit of precision damage dealing. 6 attacks with his dagger with anti-infantry and AP2 damage 2 is genuinely a big threat to a character's life in close combat, though it's fairly likely to get killed in return if the character had a bodyguard. Or you can take a sniper rifle and keep him safe, maybe have him screen out the backfield and be in places to do secondary objective type things, maybe occasionally kill some snipers, and that version gets a reactive movement rule. Overall, he's pretty cheap and effective. He could occasionally be a big threat to an enemy character if they had some crucial support characters that are vulnerable to the flavour of damage that he's carrying. I still think I probably prefer the carnage of the Reductus Saboteur more though I feel like the decision is far closer. Moving onwards and upwards into Tier 2, and these are the units that I'd guess that the majority of players might be building their armies around after the updates, but there is just the one unit that I've saved up in Tier 1. First up, we've got the Primus, nice reliable hit rerolls from him for 90 points. He's been a staple buffing character in the Index, though I feel like given the Neophytes and the Acolytes don't hit as hard as they used to, he has taken a bit of a blow from that. He still will make either block a lot more threatening though, whether it's Neophyte mining weapons shooting or demo charges on Acolytes. If he's with Neophytes, he also makes the squad quite a lot more threatening on Overwatch. Otherwise, his redeployability is quite a good one. Putting a bunch of units in reserves can be quite nice to get around reserve limits or just confound your opponent. And he does have a bit of melee threat in himself as well, 7 attacks that are fairly good quality with his sword and claw. Beyond that, he does seem like one of the best characters to use a bunch of interesting combos and enhancements on. There's a 5+ Overwatch in the Brood Brothers detachment, which seems great for him. And there's a pretty scary combo of 5+ critical hits in Ascension Day with lethal hits as well. If you had that with a Neophyte block, then you'd be getting a lot of 5s and 6s that were both sustained lethal and ignore cover, which feels like that's going to make a mess of things even with the slightly generalist Neophyte guns now. That should give a lot of damage on the Alpha Strike. He's also a core character in Xenocreed as well, so is likely to be seen leading some Neophyte hordes there too. Overall, between all that, I feel like he's likely to be a pretty relevant character in a lot of detachments. Next up are the hybrid metamorphs at 80 points per 5 of them. The points cost is unchanged, but the datasheet got quite a lot of boosts in the Codex. I would have rated them as one of the weaker units pre-Codex, though I feel like they've got a lot more interest now. Somewhat general purpose infantry killers with a bunch of strength 5 attacks, either with 1 or 2 damage depending on whether they sweep or strike. They can scout into the midfield. They've got a 5+ feel no pain now, so are a fair bit tougher. And in the Codex they got a pretty interesting surge move type rule allowing them to jump into combat. That could be potentially quite annoying to deal with if you had a block of 10 of them on a midfield objective and the opponent tried to shoot one down and then suddenly they just rock up into combat. They're one of the central units for Xenocreed and I feel like they can use a lot of the melee stuff from that quite well. Things like re-rolling charges, they get to advance and charge for a stratagem or get +1 attack and +1 weapon skill for 1 CP. And I feel like they could run quite well with a bunch of support characters, the Biophagus for lethal hits, or maybe the Locust for fights first, and their melee damage is a lot more general purpose. Now you can use the Ridge Runner to give them an extra pip of AP in melee. AP1 is just a bit too low to be general purpose, but AP2 is far better. They've also lost a bit of a disadvantage versus Battle Line, in that Battle Line now no longer gives you a higher chance of respawning. Next up, we've got the Auto Pistol Acolytes, so the Melee Acolyte Squad. This is the one that gets you 3 rock weapons but no demo charges. They have that slightly curious profile of 2 attacks at strength 5 and damage 3, and then anti-keywords to help you out against vehicles. They don't get the rerolls that the old squad used to, but they did pick up the farming command points on objective special rule, which is quite nice, and could be a pretty handy little advantage as they're going around scrapping over the midfield objectives perhaps, maybe even camping on the home field for a minimum sized squad of them. As mentioned, there's plenty more rules that boost melee now, getting extra AP from a Ridge Runner which will help out against hard targets like vehicles, or that Xenocreed's +1 weapon skill and +1 attack benefit, and could be quite nice to have them charge off into the midfield out of trucks to deliver them. Feels like at least that's one way of basically destroying something on a midfield objective and then putting a whole load of objective control there, even if they do wind up getting shot down in turn. Next up, I'd still rank the Neophytes up in Tier 2. Perhaps compared with some of the other datasheets, they actually got a pretty serious points decrease, enough so that I feel like it compensates them for their nerfs at least fairly well. Previously they were a massive 90 points, now they're down to 70, so that's a 23% drop, though they certainly did get some datasheet nerfs. You have to take a much greater mix of weapon profiles, so things like 2 mining lasers, 2 seismic cannons, 2 grenade launchers, and then 2 webbers and flamers look like they're going to be the way to go. and the seismic cannons and mining lasers were also reduced in threat. In the context of the points cut though, I really don't think it's too terrible. Their durability per point certainly went up in a big way, and they're still capable of doing interesting damage combos with Primuses and maybe Ridge Runners and some stratagems to support, particularly in the Ascension host one. And still for 140 points you still get a big squad of 20 bodies with deep strike and objective control too. They can certainly flip objective markers. Xenocreed seems like it could be a pretty good way to run them as well, to get them moving around the board fairly quickly and flooding loads of bodies onto the points. Plus it can make their respawning a lot more reliable between rerolls for that detachment and a 2 CP get out of jail free to still respawn stuff if you've got no cult ambush left. Between all that, I think they're still going to be an important unit. Next up, the pure strains are 75 points and unchanged. They didn't really have anything too drastic happen to their datasheet in the Codex, and their points are the same. As with pre-Codex, I still think they're pretty usable. 75 points for infiltrators to take the mid-board is kind of fine. They do have enough threats to bully enemy lighter infantry with loads of strength 4 AP2 attacks. And as with a few things, there's just a lot more support for melee in the Codex, particularly Biosantic Broodsurge for extra attacks and extra threat range, but also just things like Ridge Runners with AP and melee, and more detachments having melee relevant stratagems. I feel like just at 75 point units they're kind of fine to have some mid-board control, and they can charge really quite fast with their big movement and advance and charge. And if you wanted, you could build a big squad with a Patriarch. That might be best in Biosantic Broodsurge when he can get 3 damage though. Moving on, there's the Goliath truck for 85 points. It dropped 5 points compared with pre-Codex. I still say compared with its contemporary transports, it's okay, but maybe not standout crazy. It's still a big 15 points more than a Chimera, for example. It does have at least some okay threat though, getting demo charges, a stubber, and some twin auto cannons, and then reroll wound rolls as a boost for units jumping out of it, so it does make its occupants a bit more scary. I feel like realistically most of the infantry units could credibly use it either to launch assaults out of, or just use it to get into the mid-board straight from turn 1 to take midfield objectives. Unless you're trying to make Outlander work, it's probably not going to be the main event, but often you can just do with a unit to hold the mid-board early, while lots of other things are doing more fancy tricks coming in from deep strike all over the place. I don't know if tier 2 is maybe a little bit generous, maybe borderline tier 2 versus tier 3. Next up, for 65 points, we've got the explosive lone operative that is the Reductus Saboteur. She remains 65 points, so is unchanged, and as with the Sanctus, nice cheap lone operatives are just useful to have in 40k, as your opponent can't gun them down at long range, so you can position them to guarantee they survive. She did get a few nerfs in the Codex, though still for a lone operative she is kind of spectacularly threatening. 4 different fun bombing attacks with ignores line of sight remote explosives, a free grenade stratagem, a demo charge that hits on a 2+ and is a lot scarier there, plus the big one is the reactive explosives. If the enemy moves within 9 inches now, then they likely take a whole bunch of mortal wounds, though it does mean that you need to be a bit more careful about where she's set up, as they could potentially move within 12 inches but not go within 9 and threaten to shoot her down before that triggers. Might just mean that you need to play a little bit smarter with terrain, but it's pretty good if your opponent wants to move up onto objectives and she's sat out of line of sight on terrain near them. As a 3 wound lone operative character though, she's just ridiculously vulnerable to any sort of damage. If she gets charged or shot by small arms, then she is going to die pretty quickly, but still it is a character that could threaten to make her points back in one good turn if they move up and she rolls well. Next up, for 50 points, we have the Biophagus, which went down 10 points compared with the Index. Mr. Scientist guy hands out lethal hits in melee. That's quite a nice boost for basically any of the melee type units that he can join, including Aberrants. And he also has one big turn of +1 to wound against infantry, rather than the anti-infantry 2+ that he had before. But that's still a really big damage boost, and often basically amounts to the same thing. He seems usable for the Aberrants and potentially the melee acolytes as well, with a bunch of rock weapons with damage 3. Aberrants feel like the natural place for him though, with a bunch of mid-strength and mid-damage attacks. The lethal hits mean that they can hit significantly harder against tanks and vehicles, and I think for that reason he's a lot more valuable for them versus the Abominant. He could bear the Infiltrate enhancement for them in Biosantic Broodsurge, and could potentially even use that critical hits on a 5+ for the Host of Intention to get both sustained and lethal hits if you charge from reserve. Overall for 50 points I think he's just really quite good value. If and when Games Workshop do wind up making Aberrants a bit better again, I feel like he'll have more relevance, but even outside of that, he can give the Biosanctic Broodsurge buffs to things like Metamorphs and Acolytes, and that still seems very interesting. Finally for this tier we've got the Kellamorph at 60 points for another lone operative. The Kellamorph changed really quite a lot in the Codex. The pistols are far more threats to infantry though don't have precision. A flurry of strength 6, AP 2 and damage 1 shots with devastating wounds is rather nice. Could clear out a few light infantry. But also on top of that he's got quite a nice reactive move. He gets to move d6 inches whenever the enemy moves within 12, which often could keep him safe, and he could do some annoying things ghosting in and out of terrain. Seems like an annoying character that could drop into the enemy backfield, perhaps take down a chunk of things on a home objective, and then be annoying to take out and return after that. His damage output still definitely isn't spectacular, and he is more expensive than the Sanctus as well, which I guess might be the biggest rival for him. Realistically, I think it's a fair bit closer between him, the Sanctus, and the Reductus Saboteur than pre-Codex. I probably still overall slightly prefer the damage of the Reductus Saboteur, but having the reactive move on the Kellamorph is a really big deal. Finally though, last but not least, we have the single datasheet winner of the Codex and the first points for it. Achilles Ridge Runner just seems to be head and shoulders above everything else in the Codex for efficiency. Basically a unit that was kind of auto-included before the Codex, got a points decrease kind of inexplicably in a previous balance pass, and then in the Codex proceeded to get slightly better. The main thing that it brings to the table is its fairly godly debuff rule. Hit an enemy with its shooting, and then everything else for that turn gets AP -1 better against it. And unlike pre-Codex, that applies to both range and melee, so it feels like no matter what sort of Genestealer Cult army you're playing, this guy will make it a lot better, and it's a really easy boost to hand out. For choice of weapons with it, you've either got the option to take the Mortar and basically guarantee that you can put that debuff exactly where you need it on the board. That tended to be the go-to choice pre-Codex, or you could just take the Mining Laser and threaten a bit of damage in itself. D3 essentially las cannon shots really isn't terrible anti-tank, and particularly in the context of Genestealer Cults having a lot of nerfs to other anti-tank weapons, that might be something that's a bit too tempting to pass up. Then on top of that, you can either use the Survey Auger to also hand out Ignores Cover, another really handy debuff, maybe a little bit more relevant in places that aren't the Host of Ascension, where you might pick it up from the Detachment rule, or you can give it a 3+ ballistic skill to make it a bit more likely to land those hits, or just flat out boost its damage output if you have the big scary mining laser. If you're taking big squads of 3 of them, you could have one with a flare launcher maybe to give the smoke keyword. It gets to use the smoke stratagem for free as well, so that could just add a bit of durability to the unit overall. On top of that, it's fairly fast and gets scouts, which aren't bad things to have. Maybe particularly late game, it could run around doing secondaries or things if its debuff work is done. And even its defensive profile isn't awful for 75 points. 8 wounds at toughness 7 with a 3+ save is kind of fine at that points cost. It's certainly not standout tough, and some special weapons can make a big mess of it, but for a light vehicle at that cost with fairly low investment and potentially a fairly threatening D3 las cannon shot attack, I think it's overall pretty fine. Overall, basically at the moment, it is the best datasheet in the Codex. Certainly auto-include to have 1 or 2, even if you don't want to make them a big part of the army. But it feels like if you did want to, you could go fairly heavy on them, and both hand out debuff rules to other things while you also hit a bunch of stuff with a whole load of mining laser attacks and a bunch of stubber fire. And there are some detachments on things that could help it out further a bit, maybe reroll 1s to hit from a Jackal Alphas if you really wanted to go heavy on them. And the Outlander detachment also had a few things that specifically work well for Ridge Runners too. In general though, it maybe doesn't tend to overlap quite as well with some of the main synergies of the army with things like Cult Ambush and things. So maybe you do get into slightly diminishing returns, but I feel like you could very easily take something like 3 individual ones of these, and it'd probably be very unlikely to be a wrong choice. In any case though, let me know what you make of the Genestealer Cult units in 10th edition. Would you rate any of these as higher or lower than they are currently? As always, I look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments. I certainly aim to try and follow this up with a look at some competitive army lists out there. Will be interesting to see what good players make of the book, and what sort of combos and things manage to get some success. Finally, I'd just like to cycle back to talk about the Battle Force giveaway for July for Genestealer Cults. Each month on the channel I do similar giveaways to this one, and the July one's going to be for 6 channel viewers to either get a copy of the Army of Faith Sister Battle Force, or the Genestealer Cult Biosantic Broodsurge, the one with the Benefactus, the Aberrants, and the Goliaths. As per normal for the channel giveaways, there's 2 equal ways to enter, both of them links down in the video description. You can either support the channel on Patreon for any amount, That gets you automatic entry each and every month, and it is the main thing that allows me to keep these videos coming quite so regularly. Otherwise, you can support on social media for completely free entry, boost the algorithms by subscribing to the YouTube channel and liking the Facebook page, and then to actually be entered for the draw, reply to the giveaway post that appears on the Auspex Tactics Facebook page on the 1st of July, and respond to that with a photo of any 40k mini or imagery, along with your name and the date handwritten within the same photo, just to defeat the bots and make sure that the prizes go to real people. Then, after 24 hours, that post is locked, and I do the draw with a random number generator, picking out the 6 winners, and then you get to choose either one of the box sets that you like, and the winners get announced on the channel update video here on YouTube. That one will be on the 4th of July. There'll be further giveaways each and every month, so feel free to check out the Facebook page or the Patreon page. They're both links down in the video description. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, and I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description down below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.